Well, good morning, everyone. Good evening to those who are in China, Boji, and everyone else who's in China today. On behalf of CEBRI, I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar about the role of middle power countries in the world's reality. This is the 28th meeting of the China's group in CEBRI. And once again, I want to thank the sponsor of the China group, BOCOM BBM Bank, for the sponsorship of this seminar as well. 2 words before we open. In the first chapter of his book, Diplomacy, which was published in 1994, Henry Kissinger wrote that the international system of the 21st century will be marked by a seeming contradiction. On the one hand, fragmentation. On the other, globalization. The international order, he said, will contain at least 6 major powers: the US, Europe, China, Japan, Russia, probably India, and a multiplicity of medium-sized and smaller countries. At the same time, international relations have become truly global for the first time. More recently, in a book called Exit from Hegemony, written before the Ukrainian war, Albert Cooley and Daniel Nexon speculate about the future of the international border. They wrote that they see 3 possible scenarios. 1, China's rise, 2 hegemonic countries, and a new Cold War. 2, multipolarity without American liberal order in place. 3, a globalized oligarchy and kleptocracy. That is to say, an order where there will be economic liberalism and intergovernmentalism, but political liberalism is not going to be there. It's becoming more and more visible that in the aftermath of the pandemic and of the Ukrainian war, the world order will gain new shapes. At this point, many academics and scholars are speculated on how the order will be shaped. The debate this morning is part of our own debate at CEBRI about what is coming next. We are privileged to have the eyes of a very qualified academic, Boji, associate professor at the School of International Studies at Beijing University, the eyes of a journalist, Jaime Spitskovsky, a columnist at Folha de São Paulo, former correspondent of Folha in Russia and the Middle East, and the comments of a former diplomat and an outstanding analyst of the international relations, the senior fellow of CEBRI, Philip Young. The discussion is going to be organized in the following way. Philip Young will give us the debate framework to start. Then we'll listen to Boji and then to Jaime Spitskovsky, who are going to speak around 15 minutes each. Then we'll listen to comments by Philip. Then a Q&A session with my own participation, questions that myself, the panelists, and Philip are going to raise, and also questions from the audience. Well, Philip, you start.
Thank you, Marcos. And once again, on behalf of CEBRI, let me thank you, Boji and Jaime Spitskovsky, for your presence. We are very delighted to have you here with us today to discuss the role of the middle powers in the context of the US-China rivalry. I think your readings, Marcos, gave us a very nice background for our discussion, but let me try to think of 3 leitmotifs or leading motives for our discussions today. The first motive is to discuss perhaps a conventional wisdom that a world order with a rigid geometry is bad for middle powers. There's a sort of a widely accepted belief that a rigid geometry would reduce the room for maneuver of middle powers. I would argue to the contrary. Perhaps the rigidity of the system was in fact detrimental to middle powers during the Cold War. But now, given that the US and China are both economic and technological powers, perhaps a rigid geometry could actually be favorable for middle powers. Of course, this is a speculation. And I would appreciate if we could devote some time to discuss these hypotheses. Well, the second motive of this panel is to have a perspective of China's outlook on the potential of the potential role of middle powers. The presence of Guo Jie in the panel is very precious in this regard. As I understand, she will initially highlight some cooperative aspects in which the US-China rivalry plays out today. And then she will derive the Chinese perspectives on the role of middle powers, the role that middle powers can play in the current moment. Finally, the third motive is to discuss how the power interactions are playing out in the Middle East today. As we all know, the Middle East is a region which historically has reflected on its own terms, of course, the macro tensions of the world. So it seemed interesting to us to see how recent developments are evolving there. And for that matter, we invited Jaime Spitzkovsky to bring in his firsthand information and analysis on the region. But before I give the floor to Guo Jie, I just wanted to let the audience know that everyone in the panel is very well aware that we are moving into a new world order and that we still need to use old terms that were applicable to the old order to try to understand and describe the new one. We all agree that middle power is one of such terms that need a sort of an epistemic reframing. So I would expect that during our conversation, we address a few questions in the direction of what is a middle power and which powers or countries can be considered middle powers today, especially in light of the war in Ukraine that for sure shake the foundations and motivations of a number of groups such as the G20 and the BRICS. So without any further ado, let me invite Guo Jie for her remarks. And thank you again for your presence.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yang, for your kind introduction. Hi, good morning, everyone. First, I want to thank Brazilian Center for International Relations for inviting me to be part of this event. It's my great honor. And today, my presentation will center around the theme of the event and cover the following two specific topics. First, how to define current China-US relations. Second, the choices and roles of middle powers in the changing international system. Looking back, it is indeed beyond many people's expectation that such a serious overall deterioration in China-US relations would occur in the past 4 or 5 years. Previously, the two sides also had frictions and conflicts, such as the Taiwan Strait crisis that broke out between China and the United States in 1995 to 6, followed by the bombing event of the Chinese embassy in FRY in 1999, and the 2001 unexpected collision in the South China Sea. The three crises were mitigated relatively quickly because the US-China relationship at the time was dominated by contrasts and cooperation, and both sides took the overall situation of the two countries as a priority. In the period after 2012, with the escalation of the North Korean nuclear crisis and the maritime crisis between China and Japan, China and the Philippines, the risk of China and the US being involved in the crisis of conflicts due to third-party factors once rose significantly, but the risk of a direct military confrontation between the two countries was not very significant. Now the situation is very difficult. and very different. The most striking things at the moment are the trade war, technology war, and diplomatic war, or even full decoupling between the two countries, and the possibility of falling into a political system and an ideological dispute. Of course, the greatest risk of military security friction between the two countries, especially in the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea and Korean Peninsula and the cyberspace, for instance, which requires even more crisis management from both sides. Then how to position the current and the future China-US relations is very important. On this point, there is a clear difference between China and the United States. The US clearly sees it as strategic competition, which China does not share. However, there is no significant consensus within China on how to position or define this relationship. Official statements highlight the need for peaceful coexistence, and that China has no intention of overtaking or replacing the United States to be the number one or the only leader in the world. Meanwhile, Chinese academic circles have various opinions on that. I personally agree with the points that Mr. Fred Bergsten, founder of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, makes in his new book, The United States versus China, the Quest for Global Economic Leadership. According to Bergsten, competition, quote, will characterize much of their daily interaction through trade, investments, and financial exchanges. But cooperation is essential to provide a foundation for stable and successful international economic order. As I just said, I prefer this view, or you could call it an unbalanced competition-cooperation relationship. In other words, no matter how fierce the competition is, no matter how strategic it is, it cannot be completely derailed from the track of cooperation. In fact, over the past year, despite constant friction in US-China relations, the bilateral relationship has been relatively stable or peaceful compared to the sharp decline in 2018 to 20. Despite the pandemic, Beijing and Washington were able to hold several meaningful high-level talks, including 3 interactions between the 2 high leaders. Other reassuring information was the arrival of the 2 experienced diplomats, Qin Gang, Chinese new ambassador to the US, and Nicholas Burns, the US new ambassador to China, respectively. Both are reportedly trusted by the highest leadership of their countries. In addition, I guess you have been following some of the important agreements reached during the recent virtual meetings between Biden and Xi. Both dismissed the prospect of a new Cold War in relations between the 2 countries. The biggest difference between Biden administration's policy toward China and that of its predecessor, Donald Trump, is that it has first reduced conflict to the level of competition and has shown a willingness to cooperate in certain areas, such as climate change. As we know, both China and the US have important domestic agendas in 2022. With the 20th CCP Congress in China and the midterm elections in the United States, there are already indications that these agendas may have a certain impact on the easing of tensions between the 2 countries. For example, former US Deputy Secretary of State Robert Zoellick has expressed concern that in the run-up to the 2022 US midterm elections, Biden's domestic opposition will attack any move to abandon confrontation with China, but Biden will have to choose between indulging their fears or achieving a positive outcome. Likewise, China is expected to show greater determination to fend off any US challengers to its legitimacy and authority in preparation for the 20th CCP Congress, which will be held this fall. In short, there are many unpredictable unpredictable uncertainties ahead. Nevertheless, here I would like also to share with you an assessment made by Professor Wang Jisi, who is a former dean of my school, that there are in fact still patterns to the US-China relations. Three of these factors, namely their respective domestic politics, the international environment, and the contrast in power between the two sides, are the decisive factors affecting where the relationship goes. Next, I will touch a little bit about the choice and the roles of the middle powers in the context of the current US-China relations. First of all, I would like to clarify that there's still no consensus on the definition of middle powers in international relations. And it is difficult to give a specific range because of the differences in the country's self-perceptions. Each person who uses this concept may have different cluster of countries in mind. If we follow the logic of our topic today, that is outside of China and the United States, traditional powers and emerging countries with regional influences. For instance, roughly covering but not limited to the members of the G20 can be considered as middle powers. In an era of globalization and a world of interacting forces and checks and balance, the middle powers have a unique role to play in stabilizing or shaping the rules-based global system, although it will not be the same compared to or the same as the global powers. Over the past few years, we have seen that most third countries, including most middle powers, do not want to take sides between the US and China. And that is more in their interest to maintain a balance between the two countries. China does not have the type of allies that the US has, but rather different types of partners. There is no shortage of so-called middle powers in both the US and China's respective networks of allies or partners. Many of the traditional middle powers are also allies of the United States. Their choices and roles deserve attention and study in an era full of uncertainties. Whether viewed as a whole or in terms of specific countries, it is now relatively clear that almost no country can completely or willingly take sides, as the interests involved are multiple and intertwined. Given the time limits, I would just focus on, actually I prepared two cases, but maybe I should just focus on one country case here, which is Japan. So let's look at Japan. Japan is the world's third largest economy. The escalating US-China confrontation presents Japan with the challenge of maintaining a complex strategic position in this triangle. While Japan strategically prefers a strong US regional security commitment, it also wants to preserve regional integration. China and Japan had two political confrontations around disputed islands in 2010 and 12, but relations between the two countries have been somehow repaired during the past few years. In response to the new reality, Japan has chosen to strengthen the US-Japan alliance, including economic security cooperation, and enhance international cooperation to advance its preferred order, while maintaining diplomatic relations with China and cooperation in the economic field in particular. Including international infrastructure development cooperation with China in third countries, promoting the RCEP negotiations and not joining the China-led AIIB, but recognizing the value of its endeavors. Finally, it is worth mentioning that constrained by political, military, and economic power, Japan's influence on the relationship between China and the US is, I'm afraid, still minimal. No matter how it acts. Of course, we should also say that as a regional power, Japan will still play an important role in maintaining and shaping the future, especially East Asian order. As for other emerging middle powers, a key question in restructuring of world order, for example, is where India fits into the new world order. It is heavily dependent on Russia for military weapons and equipment. It also has simultaneous border problems with China. And India is more worried about Pakistan and Afghanistan to its west. In dealing with the rise of China, India will stand with the West at key moments, although it will maintain operational independence even on security issues. Each of the 10 ASEAN countries has its own interests, but they will focus on dominant global trends. Most ASEAN countries will likely opt for a US-led security order, but would also be happy with a Chinese-led economic order. Middle Eastern countries on security issues, they would like to support a US-led order, but at the same time maintain their independence to work with China to secure their own interests. I will leave Latin America to the experts here. I think you're the best choice for me to explain the situation in Latin America. Well, that's almost all. I would like to conclude by quoting Martin Wolf, deputy editor of the Financial Times, from a recent article. Quote, "This is not words, anything people desire. We need to remember the wider concerns all humans share. The global environment, managing pandemics, economic. We cannot survive without cooperation. If no, the word of might is not right. Is right. No, I'm sorry. The word of might is right. Is not a word we can safely live in, as his nuclear threat shows." Well, that's all. I should stop here. Well, thank you so much for listening, and I welcome your comments or questions. Thank you.
Marcus, you're on mute.
Thank you, Roger. Very interesting comments, not only about China, US, but also about the role of middle powers and the case of Japan. Jaime, it's your turn.
Well, good morning, everybody, or good evening for those who are in China. First of all, I'd like to thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor to share the screen with you, with such distinguished speakers. And I'll try to bring my views on what's happening in the Middle East. In my career as a journalist, as a foreign correspondent, I had devoted a lot of time and energy to Russia, where I had been based for a few years, in China. I had been in Beijing for a few years as well, and the Middle East, where I had the possibility of traveling extensively in the area, in Israel and in many Arab countries, from Iraq to Libya, for example. So the idea is basically to bring my perception of what's going on in this area that, as Philip mentioned in his introduction, has such a historic relevance. First of all, for its geographic features. The Middle East is a hub between 3 continents: Europe, Asia, and Africa. So we've been looking for empires fighting for dominance over the area for centuries. Different empires coming and going, and it was not different during the Cold War. The Cold War had a huge impact, of course, in the area, with the rivalry between the Soviet Union and the US. And China at that time, under Mao era, was basically aligned with the more, let's say, anti-Western countries, or with the countries who were following the so-called national liberation movement. So, for instance, China didn't have diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia. China didn't have diplomatic relations with Israel, with the main allies of the US. But this started to change after the end of the Cold War. Israel established diplomatic relations with China in '92. 2 years before, China had established diplomatic relations with Saudi Arabia, which had been the very last Arab country to keep ties with Taiwan. So in the post-Cold War era, we see a different scenario. And what is the scenario nowadays? Well, first of all, we have to remember that we are watching a huge change in the area. That means less US and more China. The Middle East has been a focal point of US diplomacy after the Cold War, mainly for the oil interest and the issue of terrorism. But during the Obama administration came the idea of the pivot to Asia, and then China became the main focus of American foreign policy. And the Middle East became less important for Washington. And then what we've been seeing in the last years is less American presence in the area from a political, economical, and even military point of view. Just remember the American withdrawal of troops from Iraq, Syria, and even from Afghanistan, which is not the Middle East, but it's in the borders of the region. And in this context, China has gained more and more ground in the area on a foreign policy based on two pillars. Before I mention the two pillars, let's say, what are the interests of China in the area? I mean, first of all, let's remember its importance as a trade hub, talking about the Middle East. Of course, oil. If we talk about the product now, China gets almost half of its oil imports from the Middle East. And of course, as an area of Chinese investment, basically in infrastructure, let's remember the Belt and Road Initiative. The two pillars that guide Chinese action in the area, the first one is the concept of developmental peace instead of democracy peace. So this is the first major difference between US activity in the area. Let's remember how American administrations have emphasized the political aspect of bilateral relations. And China comes saying that its main focus is economic development. And remembering that, taking into account that the Middle East is an area with a very strong democracy deficit. Democracies there are exceptions and not the rule. So this is the first factor I would like to emphasize, the Chinese approach of developmental peace and instead of democracy peace. The second point I would like to make is the zero enemies policy. China is getting involved in the Middle East, trying to avoid, and in my view has been successful so far, trying to avoid the old historical rivalries and struggles in the area. If we look at ethnic tensions, religious tensions, disputes, rivalries that goes back for centuries, we can list many cases like this. So that means that China is developing relations with countries that are enemies among themselves. So we see China developing a strategic relation with Iran, and at the same time with Saudi Arabia and Israel. Let's remember how we have these two opposite poles in the area. on one hand, Iran, and on the other hand, Israel and Saudi Arabia as the main US allies in the area. Recently, China has signed a special comprehensive partnership agreement with Iran, and this has scared many US allies in the area. But let's just remember that a few years before, the Chinese government had signed the very same kind of agreement with Saudi Arabia, and a very similar agreement with the same framework with Iraq, which is a country, let's put it this way, between the American area of influence and the Iranian area of influence. That means that China is developing this kind of strategy of not getting involved in the traditional old disputes in the area. More recently, even China came with the idea of hosting negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis in Beijing, which was absolutely something new in this field, the possibility of having China working as a mediator between Israel and the Palestinians. I also would like to emphasize that when China comes to the Middle East, it's coming in a moment of deep structural changes in the area. The Middle East has been changing in a very fast and deep way, and China is taking advantage of this situation. What do I mean? What am I talking about? If we look at the Arab countries, and the main examples in my perception are the conservative monarchies of the Persian Gulf, but it's not the only case, we see a huge change in the last few years of the economic model. These countries are getting ready for the so-called post-oil era for two reasons. Well, first of all, let's remember that these Arab countries in the 50s, in the 60s, until very recently, were the regimes were working basically with three elements. On political level, authoritarian regimes, be it a monarchy, be it a republic. On the economic level, economies dependent on oil. And the third point was the narrative that the creation of the State of Israel was the main problem for the Arab world. This was the narrative that dominated basically the speeches, the media, and of course, in my view, no doubt that for the Palestinians themselves, the creation of Israel is the main problem, let's put it this way. But for regimes like in Morocco, Algeria, Libya, or Syria, the idea of putting the Israeli-Palestinian dispute as the main point of the Arab agenda was basically a diversionist attitude. In 2010 came the Arab Spring, and the Arab Spring showed that this model was over, that there was a huge social pressure in the Arab countries to generate jobs, to generate the perspective of futures for these young populations who were basically with no perspective of future. We saw the end of the Mubarak regime in Egypt. We saw the end of the Gaddafi regime in Libya. We saw the end of Ben Ali regime in Tunisia. This was a kind of wake-up call for the Arab regimes that this equation of three elements that I mentioned was over. And of course, they didn't want to change the authoritarian aspect of their regimes, but they came to the conclusion that they had to change the other two. So they needed to get rid of the model, the economic model, exclusively dependent on oil that generates income, but does not generate jobs. So we've been watching a huge transformation of the economies in Arab countries from oil-dependent economies to service-oriented economies. Look at what is happening in countries like the United Arab Emirates. Look at what is happening in countries like Bahrain, Qatar. Egypt is also following this path, trying to change its economic model to become a more dynamic economy, generating jobs, and then facing the social pressure of having to give a future for the young population of these countries. So at this moment comes China. And of course, there is a second aspect of the post-oil era, which I would say it's, of course, the change of the scenario of the world energy, the need for new and renewable sources of energy. So they came to the conclusion that with these two aspects, the necessity of getting ready for a post-oil world and the necessity of generating jobs at home, made these countries to, basically the Arab countries, lead with the monarchy of the Persian Gulf leading, looking for a new kind of economic model. And then comes China. China comes as a huge investor in this change. If we look at the bilateral relations between China and the United Arab Emirates, if we look at the bilateral ties between China and Saudi Arabia, we see a huge flow of investments ranging from technology to military equipments. The same happens with Israel. Israel has been, since the Six-Day War in 1967, the main ally of the US in the area. And in spite of the very deep relations between the two countries, we've seen a growth of bilateral cooperation, of bilateral trade, of bilateral investments between China and Israel, which are unprecedented in history. Interesting to see how the former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was a strong, or is, no, he's not in power anymore, but he's still in politics, leading the opposition, but has been a strong supporter of ties with China. And also in the case of Israel, the ties range from investment, technology, even to military cooperation. Let's see another example, which in my view is very interesting. Egypt also embarked on a very ambitious program of reforms, which was announced in 2016 by President General Abdel al-Sisi. The program is called Egypt Vision 2030, basically to attract foreign investments in infrastructure, generating jobs. And of course, China looks very closely to Egypt, remembering always the Belt and Road Initiative, and remembering that Egypt has the Suez Canal, which is a major aspect of international trade. So China has become one of the main investors in modern Egypt. Let me give you just one example. Egypt is building a new capital. It's building a new city 45 kilometers east of Cairo. This new capital is an investment in around 40 to 50 billion in US dollars. And China is responsible for 1/3 of this investment. China is also strongly and heavily present in the Suez Canal. And let's not forget that, like in the case of Israel, like in the case of Saudi Arabia, Egypt, after the 1979 peace agreements with Israel, is a major recipient of US economic and military aid. So these countries are also managing to keep a balance between Washington and Beijing. And of course, in the last years, the pressure coming from the White House has become stronger and stronger on these countries against its relations with China.
Jaime, you have to conclude. It's very interesting.
I'll conclude right now. So my conclusion, Marcos, is that the Middle East is a very interesting example of how China is playing its rivalry with the US and how middle powers can learn how to deal with their rivalry in its own national interests. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for...
No, that's fine. Thank you very much. I found the two presentations very interesting because Guoji tried to identify how middle powers are striving to identify their own positions in a divided world. And you described how a big power is striving to influence the reality in a specific region. So where's the middle ground? Well, where's the space for independence? I think this is a big question. Philip, your comments on the two presentations.
That was most interesting, most illuminating presentations. Thank you so much for your comments, the two of you. I took so many notes, and I was, perhaps I would highlight two keywords of each of you that were mentioned. One is the term developmental peace that Jaime referred to, which is very interesting, and also it echoes the comment that Guoji made about China having not allies but partners. So I come back to that my first inquiry that I launched when I was introducing the panel. What is the possibilities? What are the possibilities of middle powers in a world that perhaps becomes more rigid, goes into a more rigid geometry? So the first question, and in light of these two keywords that were used by Jaime and Guoji, I wonder whether we are moving towards a more rigid world order or not. Well, a rigid world order is perhaps one in which the alignment choices are determined by global powers or by the superpowers, and non-superpowers have no alternative but to follow the pull of gravity imposed by the global powers. The past rigidity derived very much from ideology and geography. Today, as we hear from Jaime and from Guoji, rigidity is derived much more from sheer economic interest. And perhaps this is a reflection we should make, derives from technical standards. Remember our discussions here, Brazil, perhaps a middle power, the discussions we had here around the 5G standards, whether we would allow or not for Chinese companies to participate and so on and so forth. This is, of course, is an inquiry I'm just speculating on it. And the second thing is perhaps to think about reasons why a rigid geometry might be beneficial to middle powers today. Well, in the context of the US-China rivalry, I would think of perhaps 3 or 4 topics for the space that the middle powers would have. First one is perhaps the level of interdependence between the two global powers, the two main global powers, is much higher today than it was in the Cold War between, Soviet Union and the US. The second is both China and the US are economic powers, whereas in the Cold War, only the US was an economically and technologically advanced superpower. So today, third speculation, there is not an ideological competition, as China is not trying to export its values and political system, as both Jaime and Guojie highlighted, with a developmental peace idea and having not allies but partners. In the past, geography was very determining, but now it has a much lesser impact than it had in the past because of the digital transition that we are facing. I think geography is still destiny, but much less so as it was in the past. I think the main feature today of the mode of production is the transition that we are moving towards, which is the digital transition. I think that it was worth remembering a very interesting article that was written by Yuan Xuetong, in which he highlights that we are in a digital bipolar era. He highlights that there's a huge gap between the US and China and the rest of the world in digital capabilities. So to a large extent, the room for maneuver that middle powers have today is informed by this digital transition. This is something for us to pay attention to. Those are my comments. I think I have more doubts than certainties, of course, but your comments illuminate a lot of them, and they bring in a lot of new elements for this discussion. Marcus, would you like to?
I think with your comments, we have to get back to the panelists and listen to them, because you made very interesting comments. I would say that this whole debate, in a way, focuses on the difference between the world in which the economic reality is a dominant force and the world in which the political reality is a dominant force. And I think it was, in a way, easier to move for middle powers, easier to move in a world in which the economic reality was the strongest voice. But it seems that the world is changing, and the political reality is going now to be, the driving force. And then we have this topic that you raised, Philip, of rigidity. Where is the highest level of rigidity, in the economic or the political reality? Or will middle powers be able to position themselves in the middle between the two great powers if the political reality becomes the imposing force, the driving force? I think this is a point that is at the essence of the discussion we are having. Guojie, would you like to comment on Philip's comments and on this point that I raised?
Okay, thank you. Actually, I have more doubts than you have, because it's very hard to find answers for these questions. For me, sometimes I think that maybe a good times may be already over. A more globalized world was supposed to mean decentralization of power and a more resilient international system, but that doesn't seem to be the case now. And rapid advances in technology was supposed to mean that traditional constraints like geopolitics became less important, but that doesn't seem to be the case either. So traditional security, pure power struggles, and even allies or partnership struggles have become more prominent in international relations nowadays. And this also includes the notion of Cold War, and it seems like it came back again. And people are talking about new Cold War or something, and try to find some similarities or resemblance of the structure of the power structure or relationship structure of China and the United States with the Soviet Union and the United States, which which happened many years ago. So I do have many doubts nowadays, and I still believe that we should still to try to maintain something we are both benefiting from, like the current international system, especially the globalization, for instance. I mean, they are almost every time we are talking about winners and losers in this whole process, but I think most people benefited from it. So we need to find some common basis to work with each other, because there are already so many dividing forces around us. So I don't know how to answer your questions, but I have a very simple answer to your first question, like rigid or more resilient. I think it's not that rigid. Still a lot of room for us to manage or to work with each other to move things forward. But the only thing is that, the two countries, as I mentioned, the two countries, China and the United States, should first find some way to cooperate, or to reduce, or to just downplay their confrontation. And this is something that's very pressing nowadays, because, for instance, in China, a lot of people are talking about the military confrontation between two countries, which we can imagine if something like this happens, then what will the confrontation or any unexpected conflict will bring to the whole world and the whole world system. And so I cannot imagine, especially under the backdrop of the ongoing military confrontation in Europe. So I do think there are so many uncertainties, but I still cherish the hope that with the concerted efforts, with some mutual how to say that, hopes for a better world. So maybe we can stop something and just give a new momentum to the world to move forward. That's all.
Before I
very idealistic.
Before I go back to Jaime, I would like to answer you another question. There was an economic dialogue between China and the United States. Even in the very difficult period of Trump's administration, there was an economic dialogue. And as a consequence of this economic dialogue, China started to open up, for example, the financial system and services to foreign investments. Now the economic dialogue is over, isn't it? It seems that there is no room for the economic dialogue. Do you think that this is a central element in the disruption between China and the United States at this point? And do you think that the absence of an economic dialogue will make the world more complicated in terms of how countries will position themselves between the two countries?
Well, first, I think now we didn't say it happened, but it doesn't mean it will not happen. As I mentioned, this is not right time. And especially in this year, because as I just mentioned, the domestic issues, agendas in both countries. So maybe something not very, good will happen, just to serve their own purpose domestically. So I don't see the possibility at this moment. This dialogue will happen in the near future, but we do have some hopes, like maybe next year. We may not have much time to wait, but before the next presidential election and after this midterm election, there will be some like a window of opportunity for both to work together to solve some basic problems between them, especially including the economic relations.
All right, thank you very much. Jaime, it's your turn to make comments. Philip, you want to say something?
Yeah, may I just make a comment on what Gojie said?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I enjoyed very much listening to you, Gojie. I think this sort of idealistic narrative of international relations is much more present on the Chinese side than on the US side, at least from the media that I'm exposed to. This is a problem today. We are so much exposed to different medias. But overall, what I see is much more prevailing narrative towards a balanced competition and so on and so forth, rather than what I hear from the US side. And this is one hypothesis that I have, that structurally speaking, perhaps the US is much more dependent on conflict than China is. Perhaps, the economic establishment, the US military complex, those are the entities that are very dependent on a conflict-based international order. So perhaps this is the outcome, the narratives become different because of that structural dependency of the US on conflict. It's just a speculation, of course.
Do you want to react, Gojie?
Maybe a little bit, because I think this is unbalanced competition, as everybody can say. If this is the war, initiated by the United States, not China. This is unwanted, if we call it competition or rivalry or something. And China is the weak party. It's not that powerful, the same powerful as the US. The logic of US policy toward China is sort of, this feeling of being threatened by, the future world order, maybe led by China or something, or just losing its this not superpower position, but this, the only big power in a world. So, and I think, we need to, handle this relationship, and from Chinese side, this relationship or competition very carefully, because there are a lot of traps and a lot of dangers or risks ahead for China. And you can see at this moment, I just, I didn't get time, to talk about Germany, which I prepared to say something about that country. And you can say, some countries, big power, or actually Germany is, self-identified as a big power, not middle power. If you look at their, the foreign policy document they just released, they are trying to, play the leading role, not just in Europe, but also, in the world stage. So you can see that some, these big powers or bigger middle powers, they align with the United States, and they wage overall competition with China, not just to focus on economic circle, but also, especially they highlight the political, the value things, and they can, help them a lot. China is trying to downplay the political aspect, but this is also the very important things for China. As I just mentioned, the legitimacy and authority cannot be challenged. This is this is one of the key factors for us to understand China's reaction to US policies, and especially, in their political, war, so-called political war, or in their diplomatic rhetorics or something. So I do say there are a lot of, things they cannot reconcile with each other, and especially, the domestic political issues. And on this issue, I can see a lot of countries in the world, they may stand, or they may actually take side, with the United States. So if it is the overall competition, then, we need to do more. And this can also bring us a huge, huge pressure on our economic development perspective. So we can't imagine if, or not to imagine that, just, you need to keep your economy go forward, right? So this is the only or the most important role, or you can say this is the most important factor that China is now regarded as a, big power or big emerging power or something. So I do have, I talked a lot about cooperation, but I do know there are a lot of risks already. But back to the topic, or, I think cooperation is still important because this harsh competition will not be good for China, but it also will not be good for the United States as well. At this moment, how to give the economic development another push, or to solve the problem in the health crisis, and also to like solve the situation of the inequality issues domestically are much more important than the competition itself. So that's my very personal view.
Thank you very much. Jaime, it's your turn to make comments on what Philip said, on Philip's comment, and on all the other points that were raised in the debates. I was struck by this comment by Guojie that China is trying to downplay the political scenario. Actually, in your presentation, Jaime, you made it clear that there is an asset in China's position. It's the fact that they can deal both with democracies and with autocratic governments easily, whereas the United States does not have this flexibility, I would say. Let's hear from you. Go ahead.
Well, Ambassador, the American flexibility is also relative because U.S. can also have very deep relations with authoritarian regimes also in the area. We know that this American approach in a way is selective. But I'd like to go back to what Philip said and Guojie said, and the word, Ambassador, idealistic was used for the position described by Guojie, but I would like to add that maybe this idealistic position, in a way, is the realistic one. Why? Well, look, as Philip mentioned, we live in a world of economic interdependence, number one. Number two, we were reminded by the war in the Ukraine that we're still living in a nuclear era. It's like we forgot that after the Cold War, we still have to deal with the threat of nuclear weapons. Number three, main challenges ahead of us are on a global scale. Pandemics, climate change, environment. The problem that worries me a lot, and it has a lot to do with also with the domestic and internal dynamics of American society, of China, of Russia, is the issue of nationalism. And I think we should pay attention to this aspect of the equation. To what extent we have to deal with this, in my personal perspective, a threat, which is nationalism, which was the reason for wars in the past, and is an ingredient for against stabilizing world relations. Let's remember also at the same time that after the end and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, China is the very first country in conditions to threaten US hegemony. So this is also has to be taken into account when we look at, as Philip said, the American narrative or the media narrative, which is he's very right. I mean, we have to remember that the US, after the 20 years of a unipolar world, if we remember the very first 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, from 89 to the financial crisis of 2009, at a certain point, and this is my last remark here at this comment, there was a famous remark by Hubert Védrine, at the time foreign minister of France, and he said that the United States at that time was not a superpower, was a hyperpower.
Yeah. Well, before I give the floor back to Philip to make comments, I have one comment and one question about what you said. First is this idea of independence, interdependence, and coexistence that you raise. These are concepts very common in international relations. And we are led to suppose that coexistence is a more, let me say, primitive, quote unquote, stage of relations, and interdependence is a more advanced stage. I think one of the problems in the reality today is that we see a lot of interdependence because of globalization, but coexistence is now being challenged. So you have to go back. It's a very complicated situation because if you don't have coexistence, you cannot have interdependence. And then there's a big question mark about what's the future of the international reality. The question is the following. You spoke about nationalism, and I think this is a very important point. And you were a correspondent in Russia, in Moscow. And then I would like you to make comments about how do you see nationalism in the Russian position today?
Well, nationalism is a strong pillar of the Russian regime. If usually people ask me how I would define the Russian President Vladimir Putin in ideological terms, and I say he's not left, he's not right, he's a nationalist. He's a conservative nationalist. So this is a central element of the Kremlin's policy. Let's remember that the whole project of Putin, when he came to power in 99 and he became president on December 31st of that year, is a project of restoration of the Russian state power, of the Kremlin power, after the erosion of the Gorbachev and Yeltsin years. This is the basic point about Putin era. So nationalism, Ambassador, is a central aspect of what's happening nowadays in Russia.
Philip, do you want to make comments at this stage, or should we go ahead with new questions? Make comments, please.
I was wondering, I was very curious. No, at this point of the discussions, I'm very sure that middle powers, the term middle powers requires more granularity in light of what we are facing today, right? And I was really curious to listen a little bit more about what Guojie had to say about not only Japan, which she developed a bit, but also about India and other examples that she would have for the middle powers presence in the world system today.
Go ahead, Guojie. You don't have a mic.
Okay. I'm sorry, you want me to say something more about...
Make comments about India.
India, okay. We have a very complicated relationship with India. And well, I think especially, I mean, I don't know how to put on this, because India has a very complex relationship with this big powers and also the middle powers. If we can, see Russia as a middle power at this point, because sometimes Russia, doesn't see itself as a middle power, of course, especially like this, this this war, who on this planet can launch such a war? And the United States will not be involved. So it has a very complicated relationship with some countries, and those countries also, they have complicated historical and the current relations. I think in this region, India is more dependent on U.S. role, a growing U.S. role in the region. And also, it's like this is, if we say this is a global, it's a competition between the two countries, as mentioned, China and United States. There is not a global competition, as we have seen in the Cold War years. So this war confined in the neighboring region of the United States, of China, which is Asia, or so-called Indo-Pacific Asian area. So you can see that India has a very potential role to play. Join the hands with United States to contain China, to play a bigger role. And especially we should remember that India also on the road of the Belt and Road Initiative that China has been constructing for many years. So we don't want to secure this road Belt and Road Initiative. This roadmap from China to Europe, but India is a key play here, and India benefit a lot. Economically from its engagement with China, but we don't know that which one is most important for this country, a security issue or just containing China's rise because of the border issue or other historical issue, or just simply want to contain China. And also its surrounding countries, their relationship with China. So India has a lot more things in mind to consider its relationship with China and its involvement in this competition, and also Russia. So there are a lot of triangle relations surrounding this country. I don't know. Especially sometimes we just cannot explain a country's behavior through reasoning or something. For instance, this Russia-Ukraine war. And we cannot expect, we didn't expect, the behavior of India. So, and not to mention other issues. So I think here a lot of, scholars and also experts on India, in China, they also have conflict views about how we should shape or foster our relationship with India. The biggest issue lying in our relationship is, I think we lack the basic trust with each other. So that can be a big obstacle for us to even have a very, frank dialogue with each other. So, okay, this is something about India. If you want me to.
Let me ask you a question. Do you think that the Chinese foreign policy has an eye for middle powers, or this is not an issue? Because you see China trying to operate through BRICS. You see China developing a dialogue between different regions, Latin America, Africa, very strongly, and others. But my question is, do you think that the Chinese foreign policy is, or from now on, will try to identify middle powers and give value to their dialogue with them? This is the first question. The other question is the following. What's the future of the Belt and Road Initiative, in your view, if the scenario in Central Europe and Central Asia gets that much complicated? Because it seems that China is going to have more and more difficulties to operate, the Silk Road, Let's put it like that, more than the Belt and Road Initiative. But the Silk Road now is, part of the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think there's a future for the Belt and Road in the present scenario, looking at the present scenario as a reference for the future?
So both are very, very hard questions, and I don't know if I have answers for them. And first, about China's foreign policy, I would say that there's no such word like middle powers in our foreign policy strategy or papers. So it's a word that more appeared more often in international relations or in our discussions. But this is not word we use, and not the not concept. We see the words like big powers, middle powers, or small powers. For China, I think China saying the words as like different peers, different priorities. And now at this moment, and also before, and the most important thing is to deal with our relationship with the United States. And this is absolutely understandable. And second, our neighboring region, and the region we are now we are located, which is Asia, and also some surrounding powers or middle powers like Japan and Korea. Especially, we have very close relationship, not just the economic relationship, but also this human exchange and culture ties. So very close relationship. Not to mention the other details. And for instance, Latin America is not, or has not been a priority in our foreign policy. So we do have a lot of investments, and we have bigger trade volume with the region. And you can see there are a lot of discussions about our warming relations and engagement with each other. And we have the forum and a lot of institutionalized arrangements for us to talk with each other, or maybe also give some invisible pressure to the United States. But for me, this region is not a priority at all. And Africa may be a little bit more important than Latin America, but it's not that important. But we do have a much more, or deeper traditional engagement with Africa. And also because, a longer engagement, but also because, this a lot of hot topics emerged during the past, not few years, but almost like 2 decades or something of China's relationship with Africa. And we also have very, a relatively long history of relationship. And other places like Middle East, yes, I agree. China has, a lot of, a lot of economic, how to say, not engagement with the region, and also we have our achievements in some way. But Middle East is a place that China has no intention and no ability to be deeply involved. So you can see that. So we don't see the words as as the United States. As I mentioned, we just see the words like what we can do with those countries, those subregions, economically or in other areas. So it's more like to foster or to have some partners in the region, to have some cooperative relations, first to how to say to broaden our engagements with words. And this is entirely the momentum, and behind this is momentum of globalization and China's engagement with world after 2001, after we get in the membership of WTO. So this is a natural, this is just a very natural process. So this, for me, it's totally different. And also, I think Chinese leaders mentioned this many times. We don't say the words like, some small powers we want to control something or control somebody, or we want to have some allies. So that's something I mentioned. We just, treat them as equals, maybe. This is all related to our intention and ability. I think both at this moment, both intention and ability or capability for China at this moment cannot compatible with, with the United States. And the Chinese leaders also mention a lot about Chinese philosophy and our thinking, a way of thinking, and the culture itself. So it all defines that China will not seek the same way of rising in the world stage. I mean, just using the word like a peaceful rising or something. This is true. This is not just a rhetoric, because this is not a genes of Chinese culture. So, I mean, sort of different. And I can see that, a lot of people cannot understand what I say or what Chinese, authority, highlights in most cases. But this is something I would say that, people or different cultures have different, mentalities. You cannot understand. It's not a matter. It's not a saying. But misunderstanding will cause something bad for both. Okay.
Well, I asked you the question because my perception is that the Chinese foreign policy looks at the world in tiers. There's a first tier, the highest priority, the United States. Then you have a second tier, which is composed of Japan, Korea, India, Russia. You see countries that China, regards as middle powers. So let's put it like that. Then the rest, with very small difference in the approach of to deal with different countries. In a way, that's what you said too. But that was my own perception, isn't it? And as you said, maybe the term middle power is not incorporated into foreign policy, but in a way, the way they watch, the way they regard the world has implicit this idea. But this is a long discussion. I don't think we should continue now.
That's so hard. Just clarify everything.
Yeah. We are approaching the end of our debate, but before we get to the Philip's conclusions, I have a question to ask Jaime. Jaime, how do you see Russia regarding China? What's in your view? You who have been in Russia for years and you understand the Russian reality. How does Russia regard China in your view?
Well, on February the 4th, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping mentioned the friendship without limits. I don't believe in this concept, because if you look at history, you'll see that Russia and China have had many, even more moments of confrontation than cooperation. This is a huge debate inside the Russian elite, policymakers and decision makers, that now China is an ally. And this alliance is based on the antagonism to the US. But in the future, the balance of power between Beijing and Moscow could tilt in a very strong way to Beijing. Let's remember of the territories of the Far East. The Russian Far East is underpopulated. Parts of it were Chinese decades, hundreds of years ago. So Russia perceives China at this very moment as an ally, but many people in Moscow raising doubts about the future. And if I may add a very last remark about the so-called middle powers, I would like to say that it seems to me, in a way, I wouldn't say obvious, no, because who am I to say that something is obvious, but that the middle powers, they need, in the scenario we have ahead of us, to implement a multi-directional diplomacy. It's not in their interests to repeat the policies of the bipolar world in the Cold War. The reality imposes this multi-directional in the interests of the middle powers. So this is a more complex scenario in my perception for the middle powers and the way they have to formulate and implement their policies.
Very good comment. Very good. Philip, for your final remarks, we are approaching the end of our debate.
Yes, Marcos, I think wrapping up the seminar is well beyond my cognitive capacities. I would like to remind you that we received tens of interesting questions.
Oh, I didn't see them.
So perhaps we could at least address a few of them, and you will.
Go ahead.
I saw this one, for example, by Leah Vals. Let me read them out aloud. Cold War, says Leah Vals. Brazil political ally, but let me try this again. Brazil was a political ally in the Cold War, but it was not demanded a full commitment to economic international discipline. After the Cold War, it was demanded loyalty to the international liberal economic discipline. Nowadays, China and US have a political and economic dispute in the same space. The international economic discipline is fragile. Does it mean that, again, political loyalty is the most important, but economic loyalty, forbidden investment with China firms and so on, will be on bilateral basis?
Who wants to answer? Borja, you want to say something?
I'm trying, but I was like not understanding the question.
Marcus, would you like to try?
Like complicated. So
it is
meaning
loyalty to economic discipline and political loyalty. The play between economic loyalty and discipline and political discipline. That's an interesting question. It's hard to answer.
If I may say something, it seems to me that we nowadays we don't have a clear border between political and economic issues. I mean, it's becoming more and more blurred. I mean, so if in the Cold War they were basically political, and in the post-Cold War we thought they would be basically economic, now we are somewhere in the middle, I would say.
Yeah, that and also if we take legitimacy as a factor in the analysis of international relations, now you have a big crisis of liberal democracies, right? Because liberal democracies are in crisis, mostly because the performance capacity of liberal democracies in delivering public goods, right? So vis-a-vis what China is doing in this realm. China has been showing a lot of capacity in delivering public goods. So it's difficult now to place the discussion between economic discipline and political discipline in light of the crisis, the legitimacy crisis that the West countries are facing. So this is one way to think. Another way to think is to think of the space that middle powers have in light of the decline of the dollar as a global reserve currency. This is something that we did not approach during our conversation, but it would be interesting to reflect on, right? More and more the renminbi is rising as a reserve currency. So are other currencies vis-a-vis the decline of the US. And this makes perhaps brings up a larger space for regional cooperation. I think there was a an article in the Brazilian press about a regional currency for South America, so on and so forth. So this is another space that middle powers would have to gain more autonomy, right?
Well, there's a question about Africa that perhaps we should listen to your views. The comment is that, you know, the relationship between China and Africa has mainly to do with the agriculture for the fact that Africa is the next agriculture frontier. And China sees future in this agriculture frontier. That historical ties, the question says, is just a nice narrative. Do you believe that there is more than commodities connections in the relationship between China and Africa?
Okay, if you look at the structural trading volume between China and Africa, or compare it with that of China with Latin America, is not that big, but the structure is somehow similar. I mean, this can ascribe to many similar factors. I mean, this industrial levels and this export patterns for so many years, and even the legacy of the past when colonized by Western countries. So we can say that and also at this stage, not at this stage, but for many years, because China is the biggest or one of the biggest factory centers in the world. So this this rose and this reality decided our relationship. I mean, economic engagement. What we produce something, and we need the raw materials, right? So next stage, or as the Chinese government is trying to do to upgrade our economic structures, or China will go to upwards to other level of economic development and change the position as the world manufacturing center, then this engagement can change. And we've already seen it in Latin America, but I think Africa is sort of more dependent on the outside countries or importers or economic partners than Latin American countries. So especially, I mean, this is this pattern of economic relationship is not a permanent element of our relationship. I think it's just like the relationship Africa or Latin America with some European powers, or with the United States, or with Japan has had in the past. So just at this stage, we had this close engagement and with this unbalanced structure. But in the future, I doubt it. And so the problem is not China as the buyer or as the investor. The problem is the production pattern or the industrial situation in the two continents.
Well, Philip, you have the right for a final comment or question, and then we have to wrap up.
Okay. Perhaps I would leave you with a last question. I would not like to conclude because, as I said, I have no cognitive capacity to wrap everything up. But perhaps I would like to leave you all and the audience with a question which is very important for Brazil. Let's suppose we move into a more rigid geometry. Let's say that the confrontation between US and China evolves to a deeper level. What are the possibilities for Brazil? What is the position that Brazil would have? Who is the partner? Which of the partners? Which is the partner that would be better for Brazil's future in terms of a potential alignment? Would it be China? Would it be the US? Which of these countries, which of these global powers are more dependent to Brazil? Let's reverse the question as well. so that we would have more leverage to negotiate the terms of our supposed alignment. This is something that bothers me. And so this is an inquiry that motivated, I think, to some extent, this panel in which we are. So this is something that I would like to leave you and the audience with.
I think it's an excellent way of concluding this debate, because I think this debate has demonstrated that at this stage we have more questions than answers, and we have to observe the reality the way it is to reach more definitive conclusions about it. So this is going to be, this is the beginning of a long series of debates that I hope CEBRI will organize in connection with the new world after pandemic and after the Ukraine war. We now have to stop here. I have to say, I'm sorry with the audience if I was so much enthusiastic about the debate, so much involved with the question and answers myself, and I should have brought more questions from the audience. I hope, I promise I'm going to do this at the next session. I have the privilege to moderate. Jaime, thank you very, very much for your presence. Guoji, thank you really very much for your time in the evening in China and for your comments. Philip, you were always right. Thank you very much for your participation as well. I would like to thank the audience that was reasonably faithful to our discussions, and to thank again our sponsors, BOCOM BBM, and thank CEBRI for the organization of this debate. Thank you, everyone. See you next time in another debate. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.